The silent woods. Samantha had always loved the serenity of camping. The quiet, the fresh air, the escape from the chaos of city life. This time, she ventured deep into the forest, far away from any trail or campsite. She found a secluded spot beside a calm, still lake where the only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was perfect. As evening fell, she lit her campfire, the crackling flames casting eerie shadows against the towering trees. But the deeper the night grew, the more uneasy she felt. There was something about the woods, something that didn't feel right. The wind had stopped, and an unnatural stillness settled over the campsite. At first, it was subtle. A faint rustling in the trees. A snap of a twig in the distance. Samantha dismissed it as the wind, trying to shake off her growing sense of discomfort. But then, she heard something more distinct, a soft whisper, too quiet to make out, but undeniably close. Her heart skipped a beat. She peered into the darkness beyond the glow of the fire. Nothing. She stood up, grabbing a flashlight, her breath catching in her throat. She shined the light across the forest. The beam flickered, illuminating only dark shadows, and the unsettling feeling grew stronger. Was someone out there? A loud crash echoed from behind her, making her jump. She whipped around, but there was no one. The fire crackled and popped, but the woods around her remained silent. Her nerves were on edge, and every small noise seemed to grow louder in the still night. Then came the sounds again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the fallen leaves. This time, they were much closer. Samantha's heart raced as her mind spiraled. Was it an animal? A person? She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She couldn't stay here. Panic surged through her as she grabbed her backpack, throwing it hastily over her shoulder. Without looking back, she rushed to her car, her legs trembling with fear. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, and every shadow seemed to move. A scream, or was it a growl, sounded faintly in the distance. Samantha's pulse pounded in her ears as she ran faster. When she reached the car, she fumbled with her keys, her hands slick with sweat. The noise was growing closer, echoing all around her. She finally yanked open the door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life as she sped off, tires screeching, her heart still racing. As she drove away, she dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The woods behind her were dark, silent once more, as if nothing had happened. But Samantha knew what she had felt. And she wasn't coming back to those woods again. The silent woods story too. It was a cool autumn afternoon when Claire decided to go her favorite place in the quiet woods, where she could disconnect and recharge. This time, she chose a secluded spot deep within the forest, a place she'd never been to before. The map she had was old, but it promised to lead to a tranquil clearing by a creek. No one else would be there. She set up camp just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow through the trees. The peaceful solitude wrapped around her, and Claire felt like she could finally breathe. After making a small fire and setting up her tent, she sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa and listening to the rustling of the leaves. But as the night grew deeper, Claire began to notice something strange. The woods, normally so full of life, were eerily silent. No owls hooted, no wolves howled, not even the wind moved through the trees. It was as if the forest itself had held its breath. Shaking off the discomfort, Claire tried to focus on the crackling fire. But then, she heard it, a soft voice. At first, it was so quiet, she thought it was just her imagination. But then, the voice grew louder, almost as if it was calling her name. Claire. She froze, her cocoa cup trembling in her hands. The voice was faint, but clear. Her heart started to race. She stood up slowly, scanning the dark edges of the camp. The shadows stretched long, hiding the trees and rocks. There was no one there. Just the fire and the distant rustling of the trees. It's just the wind, she thought, trying to calm herself. Maybe it's a trick of the sound, bouncing off the rocks or the trees. But then it came again, louder this time. Claire. This time, there was no denying it. The voice sounded like it was coming from the edge of the woods, just beyond the light of the campfire. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but all she saw were the trees swaying gently, as though nothing had moved. Then, the voice came again, and this time, it was followed by a rustling sound, like footsteps dragging through the underbrush. Claire's blood ran cold. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone, or something, was out there. She called out. Hello? Who's there? But her voice was swallowed by the silence. There was no answer, only the continued rustling. She didn't know what to do. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt frozen to the spot. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. Then, out of the darkness, came a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, "Claire, we've been waiting for you." The cold fingers of fear gripped her heart. Without thinking, Claire bolted. She grabbed her belongings, shoved her phone in her pocket, and ran toward her car, her breath ragged and quick. But as she ran, the woods seemed to stretch longer, the trees closing in around her. She couldn't see the path clearly. The shadows seemed to shift, following her with every step. The whispers grew louder, taunting her. "We've been waiting." Claire's mind raced. She had to get out. She could see her car's headlights in the distance. Almost there, just a little further. As she reached the car, she fumbled with her keys, the sound of footsteps growing closer behind her. Her heart hammered in her chest, and with a final burst of panic, she unlocked the door, slid inside, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life as she sped away from the camp, her hands shaking on the wheel. She didn't look back. But even as the lights of the forest disappeared in her rearview mirror, she could still hear it, the faint whispers, echoing in the darkness of the woods. Claire. The Silent Woods Story 3. Mia had always loved hiking, especially in the quiet, untouched corners of nature. She'd spent countless weekends exploring different trails, but today, she decided to venture into a deeper part of the forest, one that few people dared to tread. It was known as the Silent Woods, a place wrapped in mystery. Locals spoke of strange things happening in those woods, whispers of eerie sightings and unnerving noises, but Mia shrugged them off as mere superstition. She parked her car at the edge of the forest and began her hike along a narrow trail, her boots crunching on the fallen leaves. The deeper she went, the more the sunlight faded, blocked by the thick canopy of trees overhead. The air felt colder here, the usual sounds of birds and insects strangely absent. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she pressed on, thinking she was simply imagining things. As the afternoon wore on, she came across a small clearing. The trees formed a perfect circle around the open space, casting long, dark shadows on the ground. In the middle of the clearing stood a large, gnarled tree, its bark twisted in unnatural patterns, like it had been scarred by something long ago. Mia took out her camera and snapped a few photos, trying to capture the eerie beauty of the place. But then, as she zoomed in on the tree, something caught her eye. A small movement behind the tree. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps an animal darting through the underbrush. But then, she saw it again, a face. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an animal. It was the unmistakable shape of a human face, pale and gaunt, peering out from behind the tree, its eyes locked on her. The face was motionless, as if it had been waiting for her to notice. Mia froze, her camera dangling from her hand. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The face didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at her with a hollow, unblinking gaze. She felt her pulse quicken, an overwhelming sense of dread creeping up her spine. Was it a prank? A person hiding behind the tree, playing some twisted game? But no one had passed her on the trail, and there was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling. Just that eerie stillness. With trembling hands, Mia took a step backward, her eyes still locked on the face. The moment she moved, the face seemed to shift, slowly, unnaturally, until it vanished completely behind the tree. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt frozen. She took another step back, her eyes never leaving the tree. The forest around her had become suffocatingly quiet. Then, just as she turned to leave, she heard a low whisper, a voice, faint but clear, coming from the tree itself. "Don't go." Mia's blood ran cold. She turned and sprinted for the trail, her heart pounding in her chest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig felt like someone was chasing her. She could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her as she ran, but she didn't dare look back. The whispers grew louder, the sounds of footsteps seeming to follow her in the distance. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the forest, the sunlight finally breaking through the trees. Gasping for breath, she turned to look back. The woods behind her stood still and silent, just as they always had. But Mia knew, she wasn't alone in those woods. The face was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. The Silent Woods Story 4. Anna had always been an adventurer. Hiking through forests, exploring hidden trails, she loved the freedom and peace the wilderness offered. Today, she had set out on her own to explore the Silent Woods, a dense and quiet forest that few dared to enter. It had a reputation for being unsettling, with old stories about people hearing voices and seeing things that weren't there. But Anna was unfazed by these tales. She was there to enjoy nature, nothing more. The trail started off as a typical forest path, winding through thick trees and underbrush. The deeper she went, the more the air felt charged, like the forest was holding its breath. The wind barely stirred, and the usual chirps of birds and rustle of small animals seemed strangely absent. Still, Anna pressed on, determined to reach a secluded spot she'd heard about, a perfect place to set up her tent and camp for the night. But as she ventured deeper into the woods, she noticed something odd, a small clearing with a tattered tent, half collapsed, lying on the ground. It was strange to see such an abandoned campsite in the middle of nowhere. There were no signs of anyone around, no trail leading to or from the spot. The tent seemed to have been there for a long time, the fabric faded and torn by time. Curious, Anna approached the tent. As she got closer, she noticed something unsettling. A few personal items were scattered near the entrance, an old hiking boot, a faded backpack, a canteen with its lid off. There was no sign of life, no indication that anyone had recently used the site. Inside the tent, it was dark, and the air smelled musty. Anna stepped cautiously inside. Her flashlight illuminated the interior, revealing a few more discarded belongings, clothes, a book, and a photograph. She bent down and picked up the photo. It was a black and white image of a woman standing in the woods, her back to the camera. The woman's face was obscured, but Anna could tell she was wearing a red scarf and a brown jacket. The photo had been taken at dusk, with long shadows stretching over the ground. There was something eerie about it, something that made Anna's skin crawl. She couldn't explain why, but the image felt wrong, like it was a snapshot of something that shouldn't have been captured. As Anna studied the photograph, she heard a faint click. It was the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter. Anna froze. Slowly, she turned toward the entrance of the tent. Her heart raced. There was no one there, at least, she couldn't see anyone from where she stood. But she felt it, an overwhelming sense of being watched. Her breath quickened, and she stepped cautiously out of the tent, her eyes darting around the clearing. Her pulse was racing as she scanned the woods around her. The silence was unnerving, the stillness of the forest almost suffocating. The feeling of being observed was getting stronger, and a wave of panic surged through her. Then, her eyes caught something in the distance, far beyond the clearing, near the base of a tall tree. She saw a figure. A person. Standing motionless, staring directly at her. Her blood ran cold. It was too far to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. They were holding something in their hand, another camera. Before she could process what was happening, the person raised the camera and took another photo. Anna could almost hear the shutter click from where she stood. Without thinking, she turned and bolted, sprinting away from the abandoned campsite and into the woods. Branches slapped at her face, and her breath came in sharp gasps, but she couldn't stop. She had to get away. The feeling of someone following her, watching her, was unbearable. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves behind her made her run faster. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door. She slammed it shut, locking the doors behind her. As she started the engine, her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The woods behind her were silent, empty. But as the car pulled away, she glanced down at the photograph she had picked up from the tent. The picture of the woman with the red scarf. In the corner of the photo, just visible in the shadows, there was something new, another figure, this one standing far behind the woman. Its features were blurry, but Anna could make out the unmistakable shape of a camera held up to its face. Someone had been following her the entire time.